Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the show. In a world that feels increasingly on edge, what can war teach us about the way we think? And how can an understanding of the human brain help win wars? Both are topics I'm exploring on this episode. My guest is Dr. Nick Wright, a neuroscientist, medical doctor and military advisor whose new book, Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain, explores these ideas. In it, Nick argues that if we want to understand why humans fight, then we need to understand the organ that drives it all, the human brain. Now, while his subject is war, his real focus is something much broader, us, and how our neural wiring shapes the decisions we make, from the battlefield to the boardroom. Nick's own journey reflects that intersection perfectly. He began his career as a neurologist in Oxford, studying how the brain manages fear, risk and reward. He then took that knowledge into the world of defence and strategy, working with the Pentagon and senior military leaders, helping them understand how human cognition influences conflict, deterrence and diplomacy. In our conversation, we explore how ancient survival instincts like fear and aggression continue to shape modern decision-making, why our brains evolved to win fights can also make us anxious in a world safer than ever before, and what all of this tells us about leadership, wisdom and the perils of overconfidence. It's a discussion that will fascinate anyone interested in warfare, and given the state of the world right now, that probably means all of us, but also just those who are curious about the human brain. Because Warhead isn't just a book about war, it's a book about how we think, how we decide, and how we can learn to do both more wisely. It's my discussion with Dr. Nick Wright on how the brain shapes war and how war shapes the brain. Nick, welcome to the Human Risk Podcast.
Christian, thank you so much for having me.
I'm thrilled to have you here. You've written a fabulous book, which we'll come and talk about, but I'm fascinated to start with. Tell us a little bit about how you got into neuroscience and how that then took you on into the military.
Yeah, it is an unusual story. So I was a doctor, a medical doctor, and I worked practicing neurology, treating neurology patients in Oxford and in London. And I was involved in brain surgery, implanting electrodes into patients whilst they were awake and things like that. And then I spent a number of years using functional brain imaging. So these are technologies for brain scanning and computational techniques, so techniques using computers to look at how humans made decisions about things like risks and rewards and punishments and so on. And I did that in London at the lab that DeepMind was spun out of. So I spent a number of years doing that, but I always really wanted to apply what I was learning to the real world, to really practical problems. And one of the areas I thought really we needed to apply our new understanding of the brain to was decision-making in military conflict. And through a variety of contacts, and I was also at the London School of Economics and so on, I got a job at a think tank in Washington, DC. And I worked there. So part of the time I was there, the chap who went on to be the director of the CIA, Bill Burns, was there. And these think tanks in Washington are really remarkable places that right in the heart of Washington, and that a lot of people come in from the administrations and go out and so on. And I was working there on thinking about nuclear strategy, nuclear weapons. And that's when I first started then working with the Pentagon. And so I've now been working, still do scientific research, and I moved back to the UK, but working with the Pentagon Joint Staff. And I work with them on lots of different areas. So things like peacemaking, things like nuclear weapons. How do we understand, how do we try and influence how adversaries might choose to use nuclear weapons, might escalate in a nuclear war, for example, and also how humans and machines can work together with things like AI, and how adversaries might be trying to influence our populations and how we might defend ourselves against that type of influence. And I've been working with them for many years, and they seem to find it interesting. And I find it, a huge source of insights about the human brain that I get in return for giving them insights from neuroscience.
A fascinating case study, I guess, because, wars are very extreme. They sort of push humans into interesting spaces. So I guess if you were looking, part of the interesting, I suppose, is that you could study lots of other examples where humans make decisions, but this is extreme and very significant. And so I'm guessing from a scientist's perspective, it's a sort of the stories and the insights that you get and the stakes, I guess, make this super interesting.
Exactly. And I mean, those stakes you're talking about are things that throughout, the history of our ancestors, going back to time immemorial, they have had to face life and death situations. Our brains are built to deal with life and death situations because throughout history and prehistory, many humans have faced starvation, violence, right? This could be life and death, human against nature or human against human. And that's why every human brain is built to win or at least survive a fight. Okay, and that's really important. And we walk around every day with neural machinery, brain machinery that is built to survive a fight, that is built robustly to be able to survive things that are life and death. And understanding that helps us see our brains, the brains we walk around with every day, the brains that people make business decisions with, the brains that people make family decisions with. It helps us see those brains from a new perspective.
It strikes me it's very interesting when you look at everyday life, the vocabulary that we use, and whether it's the war on talent or the battle to get to the top of the charts. We use this vocabulary quite frequently, and I guess that points to exactly what you're talking about, which is ultimately this idea of competitiveness, fighting over resources, challenging other people, sizing them up, winning competitions against them. That's all embedded in our day-to-day existence, I guess.
Yeah, and so, and it's important to say, this is not all we are. We are so much more than that, which is obviously a good thing. But it is part of what we are and who we are as humans. And we have to remember that. And so, for example, if you think about fear, people think about fear as something to be avoided. People now worry about anxiety disorders and all of these things. And this is not to minimize those in any way. They are very important. But we need to remember that fear is useful, right? We need fear. If you don't have fear, you can't function properly in life. So to give you an example, there are some key parts of the brain, quite low down in the brain. And those parts of the brain are really important for managing fear, right? The amygdala. Now, if you don't have those parts of the brain, if you therefore can't really, and a lot of those patients cannot see fear in others and do not experience fear themselves. It's not like they become fearless criminals who can take whatever they want whenever they want. Right? What actually happens is they become victims of crime. So it's important to remember that we need these systems. They're really important. But of course, they can also have negative side effects. So fear is useful. We need fear. And yet, of course, anxiety disorders are prevalent in our society now. Even objectively, our society in Britain or America or Australia or wherever is objectively by any measure some of the most peaceful and tranquil parts of history that have ever existed. And yet we have high levels of anxiety disorder, higher in the rich world today, for example, than in many parts of the poor world, right? Higher now than in countries like Israel or Ukraine immediately before the invasion in 2022. So we have these high levels of fear. We have these high levels of anxiety. They cause problems. On the other hand, we need these systems for fear because without it, we can't function properly in society. And it's the same with so much about our brains.
And that, I guess, takes us nicely into the book, which is a fabulous read and so thought-provoking. Let's start with the title, because I absolutely love that. Warhead. By the way, incredibly simple and yet very, very evocative of what you're writing about. Was that easy to come up with?
Well, I mean, always, the process, it always seems easy in retrospect. But yes, there was a lot of, it started off with Bloody Brains. That was that was the working title, Bloody Brains. And I love that, partly because I'm British, obviously. So but then this is a great thing about cultural differences and so culture is an important part. I've studied culture. I've done experiments that have involved participants in Iran and in China and lots of different things. And culture actually are commonalities. The brain is more common between cultures than people think. So cultural commonalities greatly outweigh cultural differences. But we have to think about culture. And when you think about Bloody Brains, I would say this to British people. I think, oh, that's a great title. Bloody Brains is alliteration, all the rest of it. And then to an American, Bloody Brains just sounds like literally just a brain that is covered in blood. And so it just did not work properly for an American audience. And so we went with Warhead.
And I guess, horrible to say, but the timing is very fortuitous. And you referenced this in the introduction to the book. I guess it's sort of 5 years ago, particularly people sort of sitting in Western Europe, most of Western Europe, and there were parts, would have probably thought that, well, why is he writing about war? Sadly, nowadays, I think wherever you are in the world, you are aware of the risk of it. or you may even be in a conflict zone. So sadly, a very timely book, I guess.
Yeah. And it gives me absolutely no pleasure at all to say that, but I think you are absolutely right. We lived in a very peaceful, particularly in the West, a very peaceful part of history. And we thought that we didn't have to worry about things like war anymore. And that is just simply not true. And it's actually very dangerous to think like. So, to give you an example, there are a lot of very clever people who have ideas that are not so much wrong, but they're just dangerously incomplete. And so, if you look at the two biggest books that have been published in the last 15 years or so on the brain and conflict, and they are a book by Steven Pinker, which was about the better angels of our nature. And I'm obviously paraphrasing his argument, but the gist of it was, don't worry, the violence is going down within and between societies. We don't have to worry so much about war. It's all going to be fine, right? And so he wasn't particularly worried. He was, there's not going to be an invasion of Ukraine in 2022. We don't need to worry about that. And of course, he was wrong. And the reason is that wars do break out and they don't win themselves. And we need to think about, yes, we need to think about, I think he's probably right that conflicts are less common, but they can break out and they can be catastrophic. And people made exactly the same arguments before World War One. And so we need to think about why humans fight wars. And there is so much about our human brains that drive us towards war. There's not one simple reason why we fight. There are many ingredients in our brains that drive us towards war. We need to think, why do humans fight wars? So we can reduce the likelihood of wars and we can prevent wars escalating if they start. And that's critical with nuclear weapons, which could, people talk about climate change or AI or whatever. The only thing that could kill almost everybody in the whole world tomorrow afternoon is nuclear weapons, right? We have to think about that, even though it's uncomfortable. And then we also need to think we cannot, in addition to why we fight wars, we also need to think about why we lose or win wars. So the book talks a lot about World War II. We could have lost World War II. And France did lose in World War II, despite having more trained men on May the 9th, 1940, the day before the German Blitzkrieg. They had more trained men, more tanks, more guns, more aircraft, and they had perfectly good machines, as good, if not better than the German machines. But they lost because they didn't use that central weapon of war, the human brain. And we cannot afford to lose in our time.
That point that you've just made there around it's not just an arithmetical game. It's not sort of top trumps, if you like, in terms of like, if you've got the bigger numbers, you will automatically win. Psychology and psychological warfare plays a key component of that. That's really the point that you're making there.
Exactly. And so, to give you an example, the Battle of France, right, on May the 10th, 1940, the Germans they had fewer men, fewer trained men, fewer guns, fewer tanks, fewer planes. But what they did is they combined those better with human factors like surprise, shock. They were better at making faster decisions, right? So they could outthink their opponents, which sadly was us, was the democracies. And they cut through them extremely quickly. But the reason as well why Hitler's cavalry were clattering up the Champs-Élysées less than 7 weeks after that offensive started was also that French will to fight collapsed. And it's not a criticism of the French, right? They'd fought for years in World War One, but French will to fight collapsed. And we kind of pretend to ourselves that that didn't happen. But it's really important to remember that the French will to fight collapsed. Hundreds of thousands of troops simply surrendered. In the first 18 months of the German occupation, in Paris, not one German was deliberately killed by the French. They collaborated very strongly. They gave huge amounts of material to the Germans that enabled them to invade Russia. It's very important for the German invasion of Russia the next year. You have to remember that democracies can make bad decisions, but will to fight can collapse. But we must also remember that the will to fight can survive. And we see that, for example, in Ukraine. If you read about what it was like on the eve of war in January 2022, eve of war, Kiev was full of cafes and all the rest of it, and everyone was having a great time. So was Kharkiv and all these places. They found it very hard population found it very hard to imagine a Russian war. And yet, when the mayor had hit the fan actually the Ukrainians did fight. They did have the will to fight. They were also given training by the British and the Americans and the Canadians beforehand. There were lots of reasons why they had the will to fight, but they had the will to fight. And they actually managed to defeat a Russian army that, in the Battle of Kiev, outnumbered them 12-1.
All of that points to, I guess, a really interesting thing, which is we often nowadays, logic seems to trump things. So if I want to make a business case, it's always got to be a logical business case. And there are a few domains like marketing where I'm allowed to be creative, or the creative. But the military strikes me, at the point you made is that actually creativity and doing things that are not obvious and not logical are really, really important and can win the day. And so this is, again, really interesting. I guess it relies on core human skills that we all have, but maybe in the 21st century aren't always, we're encouraged in certain fields to deploy them, but not across the piece. And there it becomes absolutely critical.
I mean, that is a really great observation. And so I think, the way to think about the brain is in many ways it's like an orchestra. Okay. So you need to have things like emotions, right? You need to have, so I know you're involved in risk management. The humans have very sophisticated, visceral reactions to risks that enable us to weigh up different types of risks, okay, very quickly and very capably. We have powerful social motivations that well up from within us that say, oh, that's really unfair, right? We're prepared to fight to reject that unfairness. We also have incredible skills with training. We have amazing skills for thinking forwards, for being rational, right? For thinking through problems and being creative and coming up with creative solutions as well. And actually, our whole brains, the whole orchestra of systems in our brains, they're all important for making decisions. And that goes all the way from the brain stem right down at the bottom of the brain, which is important for things like pain, which is a crucial alert system that we've got tissue damage, for example, or that can send up chemicals, powerful chemicals like dopamine and noradrenaline that can dial up and down aggression, all the way through to the very other end of our brain, to the frontal pole, right, which is the most uniquely human part of the brain. It's the very other end of the brain. And that can do something really remarkable, which is thinking about our own thinking. So it can look into our own brains, can introspect, can reflect and say, what do I really think about what I am doing? And in many ways, in our brain's orchestra, that acts a bit like the conductor of our brain's orchestra that can help us reflect. Are we pursuing the right goal? Do we need to be more creative now? Or do we need to just get on with it? And so we actually need all of those different systems in our brains of the type you were talking about, and that work together as an orchestra to give us the symphony within which we live our everyday lives, and that can enable us to survive in a business or obviously in a really serious situation like war.
And you talked about the difference between humans and fruit flies, which particularly amused me because having had a summer of dealing with them, recognizing sort of what I was up against and the irritation factor that this tiny little thing was annoying. But talk a little bit about that, because I thought it was a lovely sort of very visual contrast. I wasn't expecting to come across it, but I thought it was brilliant because
No, I'm glad you talked about fruit flies, because I have to confess it's one of those things that I personally also loved. I remember years ago, there was a paper that was published, and what they did is they used very high speed cameras to look at the behavior of fruit flies. And I was like, good God, how absolutely bizarre. These are literally sitting on the banana in my kitchen. So fruit flies, we think of fruit flies as just buzzing around doing some stuff, but they actually have very rich lives. They're very sophisticated little beasts. So fruit flies, they can obviously take off and land, and they can avoid us when we try and swat them with a newspaper or whatever. But they also fight duels, right? So they're in fierce competition for resources and for mates, and they fight duels. So two fruit flies will often come together and they will fight duels, and they have very ritualized ways of fighting these duels. They have a range of different behaviors. It can involve the lunge. They can fence with their forelegs. Female fruit flies in particular, their favored act is the headbutt, although male and female fruit flies can do that, but that's a particularly female thing with fruit flies. And so they will actually fight with each other. They will fight duels with each other. Now, humans, of course, and just to say that with fruit flies, the remarkable thing you can do with fruit flies is they have obviously a much tinier brain than a human. So we have about 86 billion brain cells, but a fruit fly has about 100,000 neurons. right? These key brain cells. And we've now identified every single one of those, right? We've got a map of everything that's going on in the fruit fly's brain. And we can turn on and off very specific brain circuits. And what we can do is we can show that we can remove a very particular set of brain circuits that involve a particular chemical, which is similar to something called noradrenaline in humans. And you can turn that on and off in fruit flies, and you can turn on and off how aggressive they are. And we know that that same chemical, the analog of that chemical in humans and in mice and so on, that's also involved in ramping up and down aggression in humans. Because, for example, aggression can be absolutely crucial to survival, right? You don't want to be aggressive all the time, but sometimes you need to dial up your aggression. So just as with fruit flies, we humans can dial aggression up and down.
And that's a really good illustration of the structure of the book, because most military books start from the history, what happened or what might happen. Yours starts from the human brain, and you're writing it very much unsurprisingly, from a neuroscientist's perspective. Was that an immediately obvious structure to you as you came to write it? Or were you either pushed by the publisher, or was it tempting to go the other way in and to start with the stories?
So the concept was always that there's a really great writer called Samuel Huntington, who was a very famous 20th century American scholar. And he said, if you're thinking about the world, don't go for the capillary, go for the jugular, right? And think of two big things and how they relate. And so what I always wanted to do was relate the brain and war, right? That's what I always wanted to do. And then you're absolutely right. So I was thinking, how can I structure this book? And I thought, there's always, the Russians have this thing, whom, what's in charge? You have to have a structure. You have to have something that's in charge, a theme. And I think that the way I basically, right from the very first thinking about the book, always wanted to structure it was thinking about the brain, right? We're having so many new and exciting ideas about the brain, right? The lab that I worked in was the lab that both last year's AI Nobel Prizes by Demis Hassabis, who founded DeepMind and so on, and went on to win last year's Nobel Prize. And he did amazing work. But he researched neuroscience, researched the brain at my lab in London, my research institute in London at Queen Square. So did Geoffrey Hinton. There are these hugely exciting ideas about the brain. And I wanted to use that as the structure, these new ideas that we're understanding about the world, that we use models of the world. And these are not metaphors, they're literally in there. They're simulations of the world inside our brains. And I wanted to use that new understanding of the brain to understand warfare and to understand our everyday lives better. And so that was always, it's a really good question. And it was actually there right from the very first drafts of the proposal of the book.
Because I was reflecting, knowing a little bit about the publishing industry, it's always, they like things that have been done before. And I always sort of think, well, where does it sit? Which bookshelf would this sit on? And you've brilliantly sat in that Venn diagram where it could sit in the military history section or the military section, but equally it's in the brain. And so you've brilliantly collapsed that, and therefore actually plays to a really wide audience. Because if you're interested in the brain, this is worth reading. If you're interested in military history strategy, you can come at it from both of those angles. And so I thought it was a lovely way to use your obvious experience to bring that in. But you are sitting potentially in two places in the bookstore.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's one of the reasons. And the other thing is that you always expose yourself to somebody saying, I'm a neuroscientist and so on, or I'm a scholar. And that's why I was really pleased that, so for example, I had, leading scholars of war. So Sir Lawrence Friedman wrote a very kind endorsement. So did Beatrice Heuser, who's a wonderful scholar of war who teaches at the German Kriegsacademy, and Sir David Omand, who was the head of GCHQ and the most senior civil servant in the Ministry of Defence in Britain. Loads of wonderful scholars and thinkers and practitioners on war. And of course, I had people who've been in conflict, who've fought, and I've spent many years working closely with them at many different levels, flag officers and enlisted troops who've really been deeply, deeply involved in many real conflicts. And then on the other hand as well, it was wonderful to have endorsements from some of the world's leading neuroscientists, among the world's top 10 most cited neuroscientists. So I hope anyway that really brings together these two worlds because they are both really important views. And I think right now we need better self-knowledge of us as humans. And this is really a key thing I think about the book. And this is what I really, if there's one message about the book that I really want to get across, is that we need better self-knowledge of ourselves as humans, as we really are. And if we can have that, then I think we stand a much better chance of, and this is not hyperbolic, I think, of saving civilization. And of course, living, better in our everyday lives, which is also important as I sit here drinking coffee.
You pointed there to something interesting, and the theme of models I think is really interesting for the wider world, because if we look at many of the models that we have, we can question whether they were ever fit for purpose. But in many cases, the models that we have, and whether that's a political model or economic models, or I guess even sort of digital model, things that we're building, things that we have built, things that we rely on, in many cases, we're discovering are not fit for purpose. And that might be not fit for purpose from an egalitarian perspective. They might just not do what we think they do. And so I thought what you were beautifully taking us towards, which is nothing to do with the core subject, is really that challenge of we like to have lenses to look at the world through, models through which to make sense of the world. And so in your looking at warfare and how the brain works, you're also pulling that really core point there about how we make sense of the world. And I thought that was incredibly powerful. So my encouragement to people is, even if you're not interested in war, and of course you make a really good case as to why we should, actually you're pointing to something about how we structure society and how we go about viewing the world and making decisions.
Yeah, exactly. So the concept of a model is really fundamental. So you talked about fruit flies, and they have tiny brains compared to us. But we can go even simpler than that. We can go all the way to an amoeba or a single-celled organism, right? And they also have a model of the world. So if you're an amoeba, for example, you have a model of the world, and it's very simple. It's a process that links senses, information coming in, to actions that you can take that help achieve your goals. So you might be an amoeba, for example, and you get some sensory information coming in about your single-celled organism. You get sensory information coming in about where prey or food might be, and then you can make actions, move towards that prey or food in order to achieve your goal, which is getting nutrition and surviving, right? Or reproducing, whatever it is that you're trying to do. Now, we do that as well as humans. And so our brainstem, for example, has wonderful systems in there for sensing, for controlling our heart rate and breathing and circulation, right? Or pain. So the senses come in, and then we link that to actions, withdrawing from a painful stimulus, for example, whatever it might be, in order to achieve our goals, protecting ourselves from tissue damage or breathing more quickly when we need to, right, to get more energy. But actually, of course, a fruit fly has more sophisticated models than an amoeba, and a sparrow in your garden will have more sophisticated models than a fruit fly, and a chimp will have more sophisticated models than the sparrow, and humans have really remarkable models. And actually, again, this comes back to our orchestra metaphor, right, for the brain. So the brain is like an orchestra. We have an orchestra of different models in our brains. And those involve really basic things like breathing and circulation. We also have some really amazing models for things like thirst and hunger and sleep. And then we also have more sophisticated models for things like seeing the world or navigating in the world. Right? And so let me give you an example of a model. And that's not a metaphor. It's literally a model of the world that is in there, literally in there in your brain. Right? And that's a model of space, right? A map of the world. So there are these things called grid cells, right, in an area of your brain called the hippocampus. And these grid cells, we can see this in a rodent. You can put in a range of different electrodes in this part of the brain, and you can read off where the rodent is in the real world just by looking at where they are in the map in their brain. You can see incredible videos about this on YouTube or whatever, right? You can read off this map of the world is not a metaphor. It's literally there in your brain, and it's in the brains of humans. Now, that map, though, it's not a direct readout of reality. It's more useful than that. It's anchored to reality, but it's much more useful than a direct readout of reality. So it actually has things like, where are useful resources, right? They're overrepresented within the map. where are potential dangers? They're overrepresented in the map. And so we use these maps of the world, and then we can even navigate within these maps, right? We can piece together different maps, and we can navigate within them to see how should we try and navigate between A and B, perhaps where there are different dangers that we need to avoid or resources we want to gather. And these maps are simulating the world, and we can navigate in them. And then that can help us link the senses we're seeing. Where are we in the world? And then to actions. How can we get to where we need to get to do what we need to do? Even when that could be potentially really dangerous to get to.
Yeah. So I think one of the things that plays into this is this idea of the difference between perception and reality. And we often like to think that the way we see the world is the way it is. That, of course, is not true.
Yeah. So, I mean, it seems to you right now that the world out there, you're kind of just, your eyes are receiving information. And then you're kind of looking at that on some kind of passive, it's sort of summarized, and you're looking at that on some kind of passive television set in your brain, and you can look ahead and, oh, here's a mug in front of me, and I can take a sip from that mug, right? Whatever it might be, or there's a tiger about to attack me. But that common sense view of perception, which is the view that it seems like that's how the world works to me right now as I sit here, that is actually just absolutely not how the brain works. That's not how you or any listener out there, that's how nobody's brain actually perceives the world. So, and we know that's the case, that common sense idea that we sort of see the world on a passive TV set in our brain, that we know that can't be the case for many reasons. So, for example, if you just look straight ahead, and as long as you're not colorblind, you will see around you in the periphery of your vision sort of colors, right? If there is a green lawn, you will see a green lawn. If there is a red curtain, you'll see red curtains and so on. But actually, and you will see though, and they will be kind of there in detail and so on around you. But actually, it is impossible that information is coming up from your eyes, right? Now, your retina contains each retina in your eye contains tens of millions of light receptors. But only in the very center of your vision do you have receptors that are good for color and for fine detail. All the rest of it is basically essentially just about light and dark, black and white, and it is blurry, right? And yet that's not how we perceive the world. We perceive the world as, color all the way out to the edges. And the reason is that we don't see the world just on a passive television set. What we perceive is a model of the world. We perceive a model of things that are happening. I perceive a model of this teacup. And so even though the teacup can be in many different orientations, it can be in many different lighting, I could take it outside and it would be actually quite a different color. I still just see this same teacup in front of me on my desk. And so we see this model of the world. That's what we're perceiving. Now, how is that model linked to reality? It needs to be anchored to reality. It needs to be anchored to reality. And so it's updated, right? It's changed by information coming in through our eyes. But it's not just a simple representation of reality. It's not a direct readout. It's anchored to reality, but actually it's generated. So our brains are a bit like, so people talk about things like ChatGPT, where the G there in ChatGPT stands for the word generative, right? Our brains generate things. Our brains generate things like visions of dogs, visual perception of dogs. It can generate visual perceptions of cats. It can generate visual perceptions of human faces. I can identify a half human, half dog, or a half dog, half cat, right? By generating some mix of the two. And this is what things like these generative AI things can also do, right? These generative AI technologies can do. And our brains do that. And that's what we perceive. We perceive a controlled model of the world that is anchored to reality by our sensory information coming in. But what we're actually seeing is what we expect to see in the world.
Which I guess points to why some of these technologies struggle to render a world that we recognize, because we're interpolating these things, and therefore presumably that's part of that problem.
Yeah, so there is, yeah, in robotics, for example, there was this idea of the uncanny valley. So, a robot like Wally, in this sort of animated movie, Wally, we're like, oh, he's such a cute little guy and he's doing stuff. And we have no problem thinking about Wally or C3PO in many ways, right? In Star Wars. Because those guys don't look at all like us. But robots that look almost human, but don't quite look human, they're constantly causing little errors. We're constantly predicting things that just don't happen, right? And when things cause errors from our predictions, from our expectations, these are called prediction errors. And it's those prediction errors that tell us that something's awry, something's wrong. We need to change what we're doing. And you're absolutely right that those robots that don't quite look as they should, they're in that uncanny valley. There's something wrong. And that tells us that we need to pay attention and try and get a better idea of what's going on. You're absolutely right. That's a really good example.
And I guess this perception piece then the military is a great example where we can look at two sides of a war, both of whom think they have a justified case. That comes down, I guess, largely to this. So that's why it's a really good illustration of how the brain works, because you're pulling out these perceptions. Somebody on either side of a war will think they're in the right.
Yeah. So that's great. And there are so many different ways in which two sides perception can play into it. So you're absolutely right. So one key thing we have is we have these visceral feelings of, for example, rejecting unfairness. You see that in somewhere like Israel, Palestine. You see that in somewhere like India and Pakistan, right? Both sides feel deep down, viscerally, they perceive the other side is acting unjustly and they need to reject that. But of course, both sides have that feeling and both sides have that feeling too exclusively. And that can lead to a tragedy. And we see this more broadly, when somebody, for example, in society now, and I'm sitting here in America right now, and there is a lot of polarization now in American society. And you see two sides, and one side has joy over a gay pride march, for example. Another side has joy over a Christian parade. And that joy is just not perceived in the same way by the other side. And it can cause, feels viscerally just right and just and just absolutely just viscerally correct to one side and just does not feel that way to the other side. And they feel the other side is being unpleasant or unfair or unpleasant and nasty. But I'd also just raise another thing, which is, because again, the brain is like an orchestra, and there are other ways that misperception can play in. And it can be deliberately played with. So in war, there's this idea of the fog of war, right? Which is that you'll never really know exactly what's going on the battlefield. There will always be uncertainty. And that can also be used, right? Our models of the world for perception will always be tricked by things like camouflage, deception, cheating. That will always be part of war. And, you see this today in Ukraine. You see this with the October the 7th attacks on Israel, right? There will always, and the aftermath, where Hamas was hiding very cleverly, they nullified incredible Israeli technologies for perception by hiding amongst the confusion and chaos of the rubble of Gaza. Just as, for example, the Soviets did that against the Germans in Stalingrad, right, in 1942. And there will always be these things that however good our technologies get, humans, just as happened on October the 7th, just as happened with the Russians in Stalingrad, however good the technologies are, you will be able to play with human perceptions, the humans who are using these amazing technologies, in order to trick them and fool them, and therefore create a fog of war that enables you to survive and potentially win a conflict, as of course the Soviets did in Stalingrad against the Germans.
And your point on technology, of course, is it can be used both ways, right? It can be used to fight the challenges of human perception. It can see things we can't, but it can also generate things that can fool us. Yeah. And so all of the dynamics that you're talking about, and we're into the sort of world of deep fakes and all the challenges of those sorts of things. This is only going to get worse, right? The limitations of our cognitive system, the things that you talk about in the book, they're under greater stress than ever before, one might argue.
Yeah, and that's really crucial. So I was talking to people 2 days ago about exactly this issue at Johns Hopkins University, where they're thinking about information operations. How can we defend our population against what we know are concerted and very well financed campaigns from countries outside the United States, in that case, or outside Britain, who are trying to manipulate our populations to sow discord, to just simply make people not believe anything that's going on, or sometimes to push a particular narrative, right? That China has the right to take over Taiwan, which is something that a lot of people in Taiwan, not all, but a lot of people in Taiwan don't agree with, for example. How can we think about that in our time? And is this something that is going to get worse? So one of the great challenges here is that deception has always been with us, right? Deception. So I'm speaking with you now. How do you know that what I'm saying is true or not, right? And this is always the case. I'm using words in order to create, I've got a model of how I think the world works in my brain. And I'm using that and I'm trying to create that model in your brain. But how am I potentially going to deceive you? And deception has always been absolutely central to warfare, right? From the age of Sun Tzu, or you look at ancient Greece, deception has always been crucial. And heroes, can use deception. So in World War II, for example, there was, during the occupation of France, the Germans wanted to find the Jews in France so they could annihilate them. And there was a chap who was a senior French military officer, and he understood how to do tabulation. He had all these sophisticated tabulation. He said, look, I will find the Jews for you. So I'll sort out the census and I'll tabulate all the information. I'll find all this. They ran the census and they tabulated all the data and so on. And the SS were really happy. We'll find all these Jews. It's going to be great. And then they were like, oh, so René, a chap was called René Carmille. They were like, oh, René, where's the data? He's like, oh, I'm working on it. And it turned out that René Carmille was actually a resistance hero. They never found that data. He lied to them the whole time. He was working with the British, and the SS never found that. And in France, the proportion of Jews who were sent to the death camps was massively lower than in countries like the Netherlands, where people just cooperated and collaborated with the Nazis. Right? René Carmille was a liar, and René Carmille was a hero. Right? Lying and deception can be extremely important and extremely useful. And that's one of these things that's a bit of a paradox. At what level in our hierarchy? So by hierarchy here, I mean, we have our whole lives are lived at hierarchies. I'm doing this interview with you now, and that's part of, I'm giving this one answer, and then that's part of this broader interview. That broader interview is part of a broader set of interviews, and that's part of this book, and then the book is part of this part of my life. And then what's the overall purpose of my life, right? Which sounds like a big thing, but of course, we all, certainly when we're young and students and whatever, sit around thinking about the purpose of life. But we have these different hierarchies. And at what level in our hierarchy of purpose, right, of goals and actions in our life was René Carmille working at? He was a liar at one level and a hero, in my opinion, at a higher level. So we will always have these challenges. We will always have these problems. I apologize that I went on there about René Carmille, but it's just such
it's fascinating.
an important story.
Really...
But I just come back to the issue of the social media. It is a challenge, and there are things that we can do as individuals, partly, for example, to enhance our thinking about our own thinking. And then I think also, just as you have things like obesity, right, is a problem of abundance, right, a disease of abundance. And I think that's really, how do you deal with obesity? You can do a GLP-1 drug now, but we're unlikely to get one of those for the brain in the near future. But you deal with obesity, a problem of abundance, by thinking there's an element of personal responsibility, and there are also elements that must be done by society as a whole. Things like, for example, regulating social media. And that's going to be really important. And your example of social media is really good, because if you're on the tube now, right, you're on the metro or the subway or the tube, and you look at what people are doing, they're not reading, most people anymore. Most people are not reading. They're just looking at videos and looking at pictures. And that prevents them. Constant bombardment by videos and pictures prevents them from reflecting, from reading and then thinking about their own thinking. the type of reflection that is so important for thinking about whether we're doing the right thing. What are we trying to achieve? How should I be thinking about this new information? And that, I think, is a really significant challenge in our modern society to do specifically with these social media platforms.
You've just brilliantly validated part of my existence. So I divide my time between London and Munich, and I do the journey by train. And a lot of that is spent staring out the window, reading books. And the Wi-Fi and mobile coverage is terrible in parts. I thought that as a bug, but you've just made me realize it's actually a feature, and not so. I thought about it as a creative feature, but I love that idea of just having the time to reflect on things and not having to make quick snap decisions. And so I think that's from a personal perspective. Thank you. That's lovely. But I think that's really interesting observation.
Well, and you're in good company. Winston Churchill did exactly the same thing. So I think there's a really important distinction here between being clever and being wise. Being clever, there are lots of people who are clever, right? It's like the Big Bang Theory. There are all these like super clever people in Caltech, and they're very clever, but they constantly get themselves into problems by not anticipating obvious aspects of the bigger picture, right, within which their clever scheme involving comic books or whatever it will be would pop. And over the course of many series of that, seasons of that program, they get closer to wisdom, and they get a bit wiser and so on, and they see the bigger picture of their lives. So Winston Churchill, for example, he valued time to reflect. So, there was this key thing that he would be in the very darkest time. There's a famous story in the very darkest time when Britain was standing with the Commonwealth and Empire alone against Nazi Germany. Nobody else was in the fight. That he was there shaving in the mirror. And then he says to his son, I've found a path forwards. We're going to bring the Americans in. And it was the same thing that he valued time that he spent on in that day, and there's those journeys by ship to the United States. And he valued that time where he could reflect and think. And this is what wisdom is. This is why wisdom is different to being clever. Wisdom is seeing the bigger picture about ourselves in the world so that we can make better choices that help us achieve our goals. It's like a super version of what the fruit fly does or the amoeba does. But ours can involve reflection. We can look at ourselves. We can think about our own thinking. We can reflect, and we can ask, is this the right thing that I'm doing? Should I change my strategy for how I'm going to achieve it? And that reflection, that what's called metacognition, that thinking about our own thinking, is central to wisdom in the ancient world or today. And remarkably, it's something we can actually also enhance and increase in ourselves right now.
And requires us to admit when we don't know things. And I think one of the things that strikes me as fascinating about when you're looking at the world is recognizing the limit. We can't know everything. Clearly, we can't have experienced everything. We can't retain easy access to all the bits of information. That we don't have all the data points that we might need. And so ignorance, for want of a better phrase, is going to be there on some level for all of us. And I think it's really interesting that societally we've moved into a space where we see it with politicians. They never want to be, it's very rare that they will admit they've got something wrong, or if they do, it's always caveated. And there is this move to sort of almost be required to know everything and be experts in everything. And it strikes me that what you're pointing at here is actually, wouldn't it be good if people could just say, I don't know, but let's find out, that sort of intellectual curiosity?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And the better ignorance thing. So that's absolutely central to being wiser. And so you look at wiser leaders, right? And one of the things they did is they had a better idea about the areas on which they were ignorant. They had a tapestry of knowledge, right, of many, many different areas that they built up over years through reading and studying, reading about all sorts of different historical analogies and, military strategy, whatever it might be. You build up a tapestry of knowledge. And what are the things that you're ignorant in? And you can have better ignorance. I love this idea of better ignorance. So, and to give you an example from my own life, when I was a medical student, I knew all the bones. I could name all the bones in the foot, right? I cannot name the bones of the foot now. Please don't test me on that, even though I am a real doctor.
So you say.
Exactly. But I do not anymore remember the bones of the foot. But I have a better idea of the size and shape of that hole in my knowledge. Right? I know roughly what the bones of the foot are. I have better ignorance than if I'd never learned about the bones of the foot. And so we can get this better ignorance. And you're absolutely right as well about changing our mind. So Churchill, for example, famously was willing to change his mind. He notoriously slow, according to some. He was willing to be argued out of things. And so to give you an example, and this is something that we can all do in our own lives, he very deliberately chose people who would challenge his arguments, right? So this is one of the big problems with Vladimir Putin now, is that Vladimir Putin is surrounded by yes men who are telling him things that are probably not true. Churchill did not do that. Churchill surrounded himself by people who were prepared to challenge him. So as his top military advisor, he chose Alanbrooke, who was a man who would simply tell Churchill that he was wrong and would argue very forcibly that Churchill was wrong, right? Churchill didn't have to choose a man like that. He didn't, but he deliberately chose that. And we can all do that. We can all, you don't want someone to tell you you're an idiot and, you're a fool and whatever. So you want someone who's going to be useful. But, we can present our ideas to other people. We can take alternative perspectives. We can get people who are going to critique our ideas in a helpful and constructive way. In all those ways, we can see our own thinking better, and therefore we can make wiser choices, not just cleverer, but wiser choices.
And I guess what you're pointing there, the phrase that immediately comes to mind is cognitive diversity. And that relates back to your previous points, I guess, about having different perceptions, different experiences, the same machinery, but you're just putting different data through it.
Yeah. And we can, and it is a part, and I think actually this is an important part about, if we think about AI, right? When people talk about a super intelligent AI, right? So the idea of super intelligence is we're going to create an AI that is, so right now there are lots of AIs that do specific narrow things. They can, around 2012, they got to the point where they could identify things visually with being roughly as good as humans. That's why everyone got very excited about AI, because an AI got to the level of human capabilities at vision. An AI got as good as humans at Go, right? The board game Go around 2016. It got as good as humans at writing a lot of things around 2022. Do you remember this was ChatGPT? And it was absolutely mind-blowing how good ChatGPT was. I mean, the richest person in the world couldn't have had something as good as I've now got on my phone, right? 5 years ago. ChatGPT was absolutely mind-blowingly good, right? And it got as good as humans. So a superintelligence will be better than humans at many different tasks. Right? Because right now, for example, the best robot in the world would struggle folding a basket of laundry, right? You, Christian, are far superior to the world's greatest robot at folding laundry. You'll be pleased to hear. You are awesome at folding laundry. Far better than all those namby-pambies in Google, in China and whatnot. But a superintelligence will be better at many, many different things, right? It will be better than us at all the different parts of the orchestra of our brains that are described in the book. Things like understanding others' intentions, coming up with clever, forward-looking plans, thinking about metacognition, thinking about its own thinking. It will be better at all of those things. And I think what's going to be really crucial is how can we get that robot to be wiser? Right. So when these robots and these AIs are looking after our loved ones, they're looking after our aged populations, they're working in factories, they're driving around, right? Are they doing the right thing? They're running our nuclear reactors, whatever else it is, right? Are they simply being very clever? So are they, for example, there's a classic example of where there was an AI that was controlling a speedboat, right? And what in a computer game, and what it discovered is instead of speeding to the end of the course, which is what they wanted it to do, it discovered the way to win was to circle round and round and round in the middle of the course, crashing into things, because then some flags respawned. And that's actually, it could do that. And that would mean it earned 20% more points than the best human players or the average, good human players, right? It was superhuman performance, but it missed the point of the game. Right? And we don't want that if they're looking after our loved ones. We don't want that if it's running a nuclear reactor. So we need to understand how wisdom works. And this is what we're doing now with our understanding about how wisdom works in the human brain, things like metacognition, thinking about thinking, creating a tapestry of knowledge, understanding better ignorance, and and so on. This process of how we can be wiser. And we're going to have to try and implement that in AI. Because if we don't do that, then the results could be catastrophic. And I don't think we can just simply tell AI, be nice to humans, because that's not going to work. We need an AI who, yes, we want it to value human life, right? We definitely want that. And we need to give it the machinery, and it will be cognitive machinery. It will be brain machinery. In that case, AI brains. It'll be brain machinery. And we want that to be brain machinery that can make wiser choices, not just cleverer choices, but wiser choices.
I love that. Unsurprisingly, you've told lots of stories, and the book is filled with stories. And I'm always intrigued, particularly when the volume of things that you could have included in the book is enormous. With the stories that you picked, did they obviously come to mind? Did you have to do additional research? How did you go about filtering? This is a filtering down problem as opposed to finding stories, I'm guessing.
Yeah, exactly. So every chapter of the book starts with a clear story that gives you an idea of what's going on. And that could be a chimp who's building alliances in order to defeat a stronger enemy, right? So we need alliances and also deception, right? Cooperation and deception. So this is about understanding intentions and so on. So there's a story about chimps, right? David the chimp. There are stories about Shaka Zulu, right? Who was someone who was a remarkable figure. So he was a contemporary of Lord Nelson, and he was able to really use the whole range, right? He was in Southern Africa, and he was able to use the whole range of his brain's orchestra. He invented a weapon, a particular type of weapon. He was a social alchemist. So he could forge his tribe and take it from being a tiny tribe to dominating a huge swathe of Southern Africa. And the Zulus are still a coherent nation within South Africa today, right? A coherent tribe, a coherent group. He was a master of using space like his contemporary Admiral Lord Nelson, and which helped him win a whole series of battles, right? He was a master of strategy, of planning, of thinking cleverly through how he could invent new ways. So he had the horns of the buffalo attack, which involved him fixing the enemy and then moving the horns of the buffalo round to outflank them and to envelop them. So General Patton had the same idea with the grab him by the nose and kick him in the pants idea, with the more American direct explanation. He had all of these different things, and he was able to see the bigger picture, right, which enabled him to build and succeed and building this society that has lasted until today. So he was really remarkable. And again, I try and choose stories that people can really identify with and really grasp. And in the longer period and across the book, what I also try and do is I start on the eve of World War II, and then most of the cases, most of the discussion throughout the book moves on from the eve of World War II through World War II, through the Cold War, and ends today. And the reason why I end today, and I also focus a lot on China, it's fascinating on China's World War II, for example, and China is a big theme in the book, is that we face significant challenges today. Now, I hope that we don't have a world war, but that is entirely possible. I can tell you right now, this is what people really worry about in the Pentagon. That's a war in East Asia with China, a war in the Middle East, for example, with Iran, and a war in Europe, which is already happening, with Russia. That's the kind of thing people really worry about. And it's important to remember as well that we could lose that war. We could lose a conventional war. We could lose a conventional war over Taiwan with China. Right? We could certainly lose a protracted war because China now produces as much stuff as the next 4 or even 9 countries in the world combined. Right? We're not going to outnumber them in robots. They're going to outnumber us in robots. We're going to have to be smarter and use our brains if we're not going to lose. And of course, we could lose if our society decays domestically. That's another way we could lose. And that's always a challenge. And wiser leaders like Eisenhower, who was the Allied Supreme Commander at D-Day and then became US president, really set the US on a really firm path in the early part of the Cold War. He said, we need to get America set up for the long haul of the Cold War, right? And we could lose domestically if we don't think about setting ourselves up for the long haul in this area of competition. And of course, we have to think about nuclear weapons because we could lose, because fighting a nuclear war doesn't matter if tens of millions of Russians or Chinese have died. That doesn't help us at all if tens of millions of British or Americans have died. And so we need to think about all of these different ways that we might lose. And that is going to require wisdom to navigate a path forwards.
Wow. I could keep talking to you forever, Nick. This has been absolutely fascinating. And the first thing let me say is I'm absolutely delighted that we have someone like you advising people that are there to help us plan for these things. Because I think what you've ably demonstrated is that there's a skill set there and expertise that I think is super relevant. The book is absolutely fabulous, comes highly recommended. I will get you to tell people what it's called in a second. But let me just say thank you so much for being an amazing guest on the show. Tell us everything we need to know about how people can find you, what the book's called, all those sorts of things.
Oh, thank you so much. So you can find me on the internet, Nicholas Wright. I'm on Twitter or X rather, obviously, and LinkedIn, or you can Google me, Nicholas Wright, neuroscience and so on. And the book is called Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain. And it came out on October the 7th in the US with St. Martin's Press. And it will be coming out on October the 30th in the United Kingdom with Pan Macmillan.
Amazing. Thank you so much for all of that. Links to all of those things for people that didn't have a pen to hand in the show notes. But once again, thank you for writing an incredible book. And thank you even more for being an amazing guest on the show.
Thank you so much, Christian.
So that's it for this episode of the show. My enormous thanks to you for listening and to Nick for appearing. To find out more about Nick, his research and his book, Warhead, How the Brain Shapes War and War Shapes the Brain, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the show, where have you been? Thank you so much for joining me. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show, then please do leave a review for it. It really helps other listeners to discover the show. Just do that wherever you download your episodes. To discover episodes that you might have missed, and there are over 300 of them, visit humanriskpodcast.com. I will be back very soon with another episode, but in the meantime, stay safe. Take a moment to pause before reacting. Whether you're facing conflict, conversation, or just the chaos of daily life, a little more reflection and a little less reactivity could make all the difference. But above all, thank you so much for listening.